Hi class, today we're going to talk about survey research, which is probably one of the most common forms of non-experimental designs. This will hopefully probably be one of the easiest discussions to have, so it should be pretty straightforward. Disclaimer again. The learning objectives for both the chapter and the concepts that we're going to try and reinforce in this lecture are first to discuss the reasons why we would want to conduct survey research in the first place. Then I hope to identify factors to consider when writing questions for interviews and questionnaires. Next, we will describe different ways to construct questionnaire responses, including closed-ended questions, open-ended questions, and rating scales. And finally, we will do some comparisons with regard to written questionnaires versus oral interviews. It seems fairly straightforward, but sometimes when you want to know something about a person, all you have to do is ask the question. The difficulty here is making sure you're asking the right kind of question, wording it properly, and making sure that the person understands what it is that you're asking, and then gives you the sort of answer that you're looking for. If you ever notice when politicians talk, they tend to either answer a question that you didn't ask, or they try to confuse you with an answer that is not quite what you wanted. This can be pretty frustrating stuff just in basic conversation, so imagine how difficult it might be when you're actually trying to conduct research. Even though survey research is probably among the easiest forms to obtain information from participants, this does not mean it's necessarily the most accurate or reliable way to get that information. People have a real tendency to answer questions in a way that they think you might want to hear, or they might not be entirely honest because the answers might be too difficult or their responses might be embarrassing. In some instances, people tend to respond to survey questions in a response set. Response sets can be influenced by all kinds of factors. For example, when children are interviewed by parents or authority figures, the response set might be motivated by avoiding judgment, criticism, or punishment. This might even go so far as to include children getting adults false information because they are fearful of consequences. But this is just one example. The essential notion behind a response set is that a person's pattern of responses is influenced by a certain factor or perhaps certain perspective. One of these factors is social desirability. What this essentially means is that people have a tendency to want to appear socially acceptable, and people may respond to questions in a way that sort of goes with the flow or is what they think is generally acceptable to others. Of course, not all people respond this way, but most people tend to do so. So in the forensic arena, I run into this problem all the time because people who are in trouble from a criminal justice standpoint will often tend to underreport their criminal history, their substance abuse history, and so forth. This is because they want to appear better than they might actually be, or perhaps maybe appear less bad than they actually are. So in some instances, this kind of thing is straight up lying, but in other instances, it might be admitting only certain facts or omitting certain facts. So the difficulty becomes, how do we get people to answer difficult questions honestly? One of the ways that we can encourage people to get us the answers that we're looking for is presenting them with survey questions that lean on research done by cognitive psychologists. Fortunately, these previous researchers have identified a number of problematic areas that tend to produce the most confusion when people are presented with questions on surveys. For example, we want to avoid unfamiliar technical terms like jargon, psychobabble, things like that. Also vague or imprecise terms like kinda, sorta, and like. Poorly worded sentence structure should also be avoided, and sentences that are just flat out too long or complex that would overload a person's attention span or working memory. Finally, sometimes the information that precedes or follows a question might mislead the person into thinking that the question is really asking something other than what it states. And so obviously we want to avoid that as well. Ideally, we want to word questions in a way that is the most straightforward and simple. Avoid double-barreled questions. The example given here is, should senior citizens be given money for recreation centers and food assistance programs? But in reality, this is sort of mixing two different concepts or issues at the same time. Realistically, a person might actually have different attitudes about whether money should be spent on recreation centers versus food assistance programs rather than both at the same time. So also we want to avoid loaded questions. Notice in this example, do you favor eliminating the wasteful excesses in budget? This question uses terminology like wasteful to suggest an emotional charge in the phraseology that we want to avoid, because the wording matters and influences people's response style. So like in the textbook, we want to avoid using words that are just too emotionally charged. Instead, we want to use words that are less likely to lead to biased responses. And we can do this through using a more behavior-based terminology when and where possible. Finally, we should try to avoid using phrasing that has negatives. Notice in the example, what they're saying is, do you feel that the city should not approve the proposed women's shelter, instead of saying, do you feel that the city should reject the proposed women's shelter? Or one way that you could ask it is, should the city approve the women's proposed shelter, and then just simply look at people who disagree with that statement to determine whether people approve it or not. Introducing the word not can sometimes create confusion. Finally, we want to try and avoid questions that play into a response set where people might have a tendency to tacitly agree or disagree. This is what we refer to as yay saying or nay saying. And we see this a lot in mental health settings where people might be somewhat attention seeking and want to play the role of patient. And so they may endorse all kinds of symptoms that they don't actually have, because they think if they do endorse those things that they can get access to treatment they wouldn't ordinarily get. So in addition to asking questions where a person would obviously say, yes, I have that problem, we can mix it up with questions where a person would obviously have to say no, or we could reverse the wording in the question so that it would not make sense for the person to say yes. So in other words, we don't want a questionnaire where literally every question has a correct response of yes, or they're all no type of responses. We would need to mix it up so people have to do a little bit of mental work to answer those questions, and so we can feel confident that we are actually tapping into the information rather than just getting automatic response styles from people. Okay, so let's go over two basic ways that we can get responses from participants. And we can divide this into two categories of closed-ended or open-ended responses. So closed-ended questions are framed in a way where a person's response style is sort of an expected response, meaning, for example, when people respond to true or false questions or yes or no questions, also closed-ended questions elicit a very brief response. So if I asked you, what is the title of the class Psych 290? The response would be research methods. You don't need to elaborate or give any other details. That's the right answer. So as you can see, the goal of a closed-ended question is really to limit the person's ability to respond in detail to a question. And sometimes this might actually be desirable, but other times this might also be undesirable depending on what type of information you're seeking. This can be desirable if what you're looking for is the person's ability to relate factual information, but contrast this with open-ended questions. When we ask an open-ended question, we are assessing a person's ability to relate rational or reasoned information, meaning we're trying to measure the way that they think or how they communicate their response. And so we will give them a wider degree of latitude to answer the question in a way that makes sense. The difficulty here is that sometimes people will ramble and get off topic and may not even ever really answer the question that you asked. Therefore, it can make it really difficult to determine whether they ever arrived at the correct answer or not. The advantage here is that sometimes it gives you an opportunity to examine how well a person understands a concept. For example, in the forensic settings where I work sometimes, Let's say a juvenile is charged with trespassing, and I ask what it is that he or she is being charged with. If he or she says trespassing, they answer a closed-ended question. I might then follow up with a question such as, well, tell me what it means when somebody is accused of trespassing, or when the people use the word trespassing, what does that really mean? So as you can see, there are different ways to get information that you're looking for based on how the question is asked. Sometimes it is useful to ask a question where what we are looking for is a yes or a no, or any true or false type of response, but there are also times when there is no clear yes or no answer, or the answer might be something along the lines of sometimes, or well, it depends. One of the ways that we can get around this is by encouraging participants to answer a question where they can agree to a statement on a rating scale. For example, 1 might mean always, 2 might mean most of the time, 3 might mean sometimes, 4 might mean rarely, and 5 might mean never. I think if you've ever answered a questionnaire for a medical history or participated in questionnaires in intro psychology classes, they use stuff like this. And this is an example of the second point, the semantic differential scale. Moving to the graphic rating scale, I've seen medical facilities use number lines that go from maybe 0 to 100, where a person can simply make a check mark or put an X on the line for how much pain they're experiencing, or so forth. This gives us a more continuous version rather than maybe 5 categories like I mentioned a moment ago, because when you have 5 categories, you really only have 5 response options, but when you have a number line that goes from 0 to 100, you have literally 100 different response options. So finally, there are also nonverbal aspects that we can use where there really is no wording necessary. This might be useful in situations where people can't read, or people might have limited English proficiency. But these graphics are used for people that can also better match their emotional content if that's what we're looking for. So in the graphic that I've included here, there's kind of like a pain scale or a discomfort scale. And this can be done with all kinds of different graphics depending on what it is that we're measuring. This slide sort of elaborates somewhat on what I just mentioned a moment ago between having labels that identify certain categories of agreement with the question being asked. And as you can see on point number 2, there's oftentimes a neutral point in the middle where people might not be able to endorse an answer in one way or another, indicating that either they don't know or maybe that they don't care. A funny study that was done right here at ASU many years ago had to do with college students who rated their own attractiveness. And you can see in the comparative rating scales that people can rate themselves in the lower 50%, upper 50%, and so on. Well, interestingly, the vast majority of ASU students rated themselves in the upper 50 to upper 25% of attractiveness compared to the general population. I still think that's hilarious. Finally, another example of labeling alternative responses is to measure the frequency of a certain type of behavior. This is super common in substance abuse research, where we're attempting to get a handle on how much a person might be using alcohol or drugs or prescription pills. And we might ask whether they are drinking once a week, twice a week, maybe once a month, or whatever it is that we think is important. When we give a survey to a person to answer, we want to ensure that it actually looks professional, that it doesn't have typos and look like a bad photocopy from 1983. We also want to be consistent in using the same type of format through the entire questionnaire when possible, so that it doesn't feel confusing or inconsistent. If you notice in this slide, it says to put the most interesting and important questions first. I think that that's true most of the time, but not necessarily always. In some instances, the initial questions posed are filler questions meant to sort of wear a person down, and the later questions are the ones that actually have some meaning on the subject that you're trying to measure. But in certain instances, the researcher might be conducting research with a focus group, like if we're trying to assess people's reactions to a new commercial for an internet ad. And we might want to ensure that we're keeping track of people's comments and how one comment might lead to another. Alternatively, sometimes we have an entire room of people responding to the same written questionnaire and there is no verbal aspect to it other than if maybe somebody has a question about the content of what's in the questionnaire. When I was in graduate school and working with professors to develop questionnaires, we went through several trials where we were refining the questions and making them less confusing and better worded by giving them to a small group of other individuals to sort of test them out and gauge their reactions out loud to what they thought the questions were asking or if they were confusing. Having been a researcher, I think I can identify with pretty much every part of this slide. In written form, questionnaires are often completed by the participant in a pencil and paper sort of fashion. And usually this is fairly cheap in terms of materials, but it can be a huge hassle to keep track of all the paperwork and find a place to store all of it. I've been a researcher where we've also mailed questionnaires to people and expect them to send it back completed. Sometimes these interviews are done in person, sometimes just to one person at a time. Sometimes we do this in groups and through the internet, obviously as well. One of the problems that we sometimes run into, especially when we're not looking at college students as participants, is that we automatically assume that the participant is literate and has a reading ability high enough to comprehend the questions. Perhaps they might also have another language as their primary language, and so understanding English might be a challenge for them. One factor that gets overlooked far too often is how long a participant can actually sit there and answer questions on a very long survey before they want to run out of the room. This stuff can be pretty boring for participants and can feel very monotonous. So in some instances, shorter can be better, or offering participants breaks between questionnaires. Earlier in this lecture, I might have mentioned that there are clear benefits and pitfalls to doing interview or survey research. This is clearly the biggest bang for the buck and is usually the cheapest way to conduct research. In today's world, it's becoming increasingly common for internet-based surveys to be sort of the standard methodology because it's super convenient, it's fairly cheap, it produces less waste, and we tend to get a higher response rate. If interviewers are present in the room and available during in-person interviews, then we also have the opportunity to answer questions or provide clarification where necessary. So that's one advantage to doing it that way. The downside of doing interviews or survey research is that interviewers can accidentally or inadvertently show some type of bias. Additionally, there is some research out there that suggests that interviewer characteristics can also lead to different response styles of participants. So for example, when I have students responding to a questionnaire when I'm in the room as an older male, the response style might be different than if I have a young female research assistant who is obviously going to be different looking than I am. So in other words, based on the person in the room who's conducting research and their characteristics, the expectations of participants might lead to different or even inaccurate response styles. So we have to be very careful about how we do this when we're conducting survey research in person. Obviously, face-to-face interviews is pretty self-explanatory, although with the advent of tools like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and whatnot, people can do virtual face-to-face interviews. In fact, when I interviewed for this job here at ASU, it was right at the beginning of COVID, and they were no longer doing face-to-face interviews, but the best way they could approximate that was to use Zoom. It used to be the case that telephone interviews were less expensive and more efficient because when we did face-to-face interviews in the past, in person, this meant that people had to travel and show up and set up a room and so forth, and then people didn't show up on time and it made things kind of a big hassle. So that was just not cost effective at all. However, this was also seen as sort of the gold standard. I wouldn't get too caught up in computer-assisted telephone interviews and interactive voice response technology because these are rarely used nowadays since we have internet-based survey research as well as video interviews, as I mentioned already. And I already talked a little bit about focus interviews in the previous slide, so I'm just going to move forward. When we conduct survey research with a group of people, it is our hope that the group that we're looking at is a representative sample of the greater population that we're making statements about. So for example, if we sample a portion of the population that is almost entirely white and living in North Scottsdale or some other really affluent area, this would not be very representative of the greater population of interest. One of the biggest criticisms of college-based research is that most of the participants are young, and at least they're affluent enough that they can obtain a college education, not to mention that they're likely going to be more literate and more intelligent than a lot of other people. So again, is this likely to be an appropriate sample that represents the entire population? Maybe, maybe not. However, it is our hope that we can do our best to get a sample that does the best job that we can. Hopefully, folks will remember from their statistics course what a confidence interval is. We'll talk about that just briefly here. A confidence interval is essentially a probability statement that we make to say how confident we are that our sample is representative of the true population. A really common example of this, and I know you're probably sick of hearing it, is IQ research. The most well-designed and complex IQ assessments can accurately score a person's IQ within a few points within a 95% confidence interval. So, to put this in perspective, an average IQ score is 100. And if you scored 100 on an IQ test, you would just be average. We could also say that the overwhelming majority of people who scored similarly to you would probably be in the range of about 93 to 107 IQ 95% of the time, which is actually not a very significant difference. It might sound like a lot, but it actually doesn't mean much in reality. And this is a good thing because it means that what we're measuring is a very narrow area and we can feel very confident about what it means. The next concept is sampling error. The easiest way to think of this is that it is the opposite of a confidence interval. Just like when we were talking about measurement error being the difference between a person's recorded score on a questionnaire and then their true score in reality, the same is true for populations. This is kind of a weird concept, but when we make a statement about our research being reflective of the greater population, we're basing that off of only a sample of the population that we actually tested. So naturally, there's going to be some difference between our sample and the greater population. So that's what sampling error refers to. This is sort of a necessary evil that we have to think about because there's no real way that we can use the entire population as our sample. There's just too many people. However, the more people that we get in our study as participants, the less of a problem this will be. This is kind of an advanced concept in research methods, but for the purposes of this class, let's just say that the more participants you have in a study, the more strength you're going to have in terms of your confidence interval. But in reality, in advanced concepts, this is true up to a certain point. But we won't get into that here. Just for the purpose of this class, let's just consider it a truism that the more people you have, the more likely it is that you're going to have a generalizable sample. Probability sampling. How we obtain our samples matters. The easiest way to obtain a sample is by allowing a person to participate out of sheer probability, like random. We would like to think that anybody potentially could be chosen to participate in a study or at least have the opportunity to participate, but in reality this is not true. We like to pretend that it is because we can always extend our research opportunities to every single person out there. But simple random sampling means that every member of the population has an equal probability of being selected. This would mean something like you randomly select 1,000 people out of the entire United States of America, and whatever that group looks like in terms of sampling is what you get. And it is assumed that this sample would be representative of the general population at large. Obviously, there's going to be some problems with that because we can't always anticipate that we're going to capture specific populations that might matter. For example, if we're truly interested in looking at differences between people's responses and what that might be from different demographics, like people who are underrepresented in general, they're still going to be underrepresented in your sample. So to overcome this, sometimes researchers will use stratified random sampling. One easy example here would be to break down the sample by level of income. The vast majority of respondents in survey research would be individuals who are probably within maybe 3 or 4 different income brackets, while there will be a handful of people that are either significantly below average in terms of income, while there will be a handful of people that are significantly above average. If we wanted to truly understand differences between these groups, then we would need to have relatively equal numbers between these groups. For example, it wouldn't make any kind of sense if we had 2,000 participants who made less than $50,000 a year, but only 20 participants that made more than $50,000 a year. So from a statistical standpoint, that would not be an adequate comparison. Similarly, cluster sampling is a related concept. This means that researchers will deliberately make efforts to try and get information from specific groups in order to make their analysis more statistically feasible and therefore be able to draw stronger and more meaningful conclusions. Here in Arizona, one of the things that we have to be thinking about is representation of indigenous people and how response styles from this population might be different from other populations. And if we're truly interested in these differences, then we might need to make efforts to ensure that indigenous peoples are adequately represented in the sample. If there is an insufficient number of people in our study from indigenous populations, then we would obviously not be able to make adequate or informed statements or conclusions about them. Non-probability sampling. This is a harder concept, I think, because as opposed to probability sampling, where everyone has a specific probability of being chosen to be included in the sample, non-probability sampling means that there is no way to really calculate that probability because it's just too complex, or other factors make this pretty much unknowable. I know that's pretty abstract stuff and I apologize, but just keep in mind that non-probability sampling is just a different way to grab people to participate in a study. For example, we can look at a method called convenience sampling, which is sort of like haphazardly finding people and asking them questions. I think a lot about this sort of man on the street kinds of interviews that people do on campus or on the internet, where some type of interviewer is just casually walking down the sidewalk and stops a random person and asks them a series of questions. Obviously, there are a lot of problems with using this method, but it is still a method that could be useful in certain circumstances. Purposive sampling is a similar concept because it allows researchers to try and target a specific population that they want to gain information from. The book uses the example of getting responses from people in a certain setting or in a certain age demographic. Again, this can be useful because the target group is certainly being tapped into, but then we lose some credibility with regard to sampling and convenience issues. Finally, quota sampling. Obviously, we are not selecting people at random. One may have some quotas for how many people we need in a study to be able to do group comparisons. Like I mentioned earlier, if we wanted to compare attitudes of college students, we would need to have the same number of freshmen, sophomore, junior, seniors, and graduate students equally represented in order to have sufficient faith in the statistical analysis. However, we can't guarantee that we're necessarily going to get enough of one group or another, and so if we ended up having a shortage of, let's say, graduate students on our questionnaire, then we'd have to find a way to target that group. So maybe we would have to go to a graduate class and recruit more participants. So obviously this is a downside to quota sampling because it reduces the generalizability. And like other forms of non-probability sampling, it is way more likely to introduce bias into the sample because we're actually, kind of running down specific people that we're looking for. Thinking about how to sample the population for a particular type of research, we should try our best to ensure that the sample that we are examining is as representative of the population as we can, because otherwise the information is not particularly useful. Also, we want to do everything we can to eliminate bias, meaning we are not specifically excluding certain individuals or overly including others because of our own biases or because of lack of access or some other factor. Ideally, when we engage in probability sampling, we would like for our research to contain as varied of a population as possible because, again, this is the most generalizable set of information we can get. In reality, though, this is extremely difficult and almost never fully achieved. Even when we can magically get a random sample, there are still ways that bias can find its way into the sample. For example, again, when we take a sample, it's simply just carving out a portion of the actual population. And the actual population is limited by all kinds of factors such as demographics, income, all kinds of other factors. And we often will try our best to record some of the demographic information up front from participants in order to gauge what the sampling frame looks like when we're doing our research. Because we know that it's not entirely going to be representative of the general population. Another source of bias is the response rate. Inevitably, even in spite of our best efforts, there will be people who won't respond to the questions as asked. For example, when I was conducting research on justice outcomes, questionnaires went out to the courts of all 50 states. But in some instances, only 26 states responded. So when we make statements about our findings, it's going to be limited by the fact that we didn't get the kind of response rate that we were hoping for. And literally half the other states were not represented by our data. Obviously, this can have all kinds of problems when interpreting what the research means. So as you can see, response rate is a big deal, and we should take steps to encourage a high response rate. Sometimes that can be done in smaller settings by doing things like offering incentives to participate or some type of reward or giving people gift cards and things like that. But on a larger scale, it's a lot more difficult. Okay, folks, I hope this was helpful, and as always, feel free to email your course assistant or me if you have any questions about the content. Have a good one.